What's up, everyone? Today I'm sharing the 4 finalists of our Unpopular Background Commander deck video. There were 110 amazing and super unique decks that were submitted, which made it very difficult to choose these finalists, but I'm really excited to share the ones that really stood out to me. After watching this video, I'm going to open a poll for you to vote on your favorite, and the fan favorite will win a Borderless Foil Blood Crypt from Infinity. I do one competition every month that is free for anyone to participate, and I've actually already announced the topic of the next one in one of my community posts, which will be decks made from any 2 sets combined, excluding master sets, but more to come on that in a different video. Our first deck today is called Earthquake Boros and is a Lulu Loyal Hollyphant paired with Guild Artisan deck. This is the highest deck count today and has 258 total decks on EDH Rec. For anyone who's not familiar, Lulu is a 4-mana 3/2 with flying that says, at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each tapped creature you control, then untap them. The background, Guild Artisan, says, for 2 mana, commander creatures you own have, whenever this creature attacks a player, if no opponent has more life than that player, you create 2 treasure tokens. So when I asked people to submit a description of their deck, the owner said, white has the best ramp in the game if you have less lands than your opponents. So let's out-ramp green decks by running all the bounce lands and sack lands we can. It then combines Flying Tribal with Earthquake effects to control opponents and close the game. Unlike most Boros decks, we're running heaps of draw so we never stall out. Awesome. So what I really like about this deck is that it is very deliberate about the lands package it runs, which usually is kind of an afterthought in a lot of casual decks. Like, they build out the deck list first and then they throw in 36 or 38 lands that will fix the mana, but it's, the same land count every time. For this deck, having less lands than your opponents is core to the strategy, but it's also focused on getting those lands back, and if you're able to get to parity on land count, you'll likely be able to produce, almost double the amount of mana than your opponents who have the same amount of lands. So I'm actually going to dive into the lands package first. This deck runs various bounce lands to reduce your land count, so things like Arid Archway, Boros Garrison, and Guildless Commons can all return a land to lower your land count. Then there's several sacrifice lands effects, like Balduvian Trading Post can sacrifice a mountain, and then it adds 1 generic and 1 red every time it's tapped. Lotus Field sacks 2 lands and taps for 3. Lotus Veil also sacks 2 untapped lands and taps for 3. Then there's Scorched Ruins, which also sacrifices 2 untapped lands but adds 4 mana. While we're talking about lands that tap for multiple mana, this is an artifact, but Dousing Dagger transforms into a land that taps for 3 mana as well. So there's a lot of lands that can tap for multiple mana. Then there's other utility lands like Deserted Temple, which can untap one of the Lotus Veil to generate a lot of mana between the 2 of them. There's Thespian Stage and Vesuva, which can become copies of your big mana-producing lands. Then the last type are lands that can help activate Lulu's ability of a permanent leaving the battlefield. So there's Lazotep Quarry, Marsh Flats, Scalding Tarn, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Foothills can all be sacked, which will then help to activate that set ability. So now that we've covered the lands that reduce the total number of count of lands on your battlefield, here are some abilities that ramp when you have fewer lands than your opponents. Archaeomancer's Map can ramp a land whenever someone else plays one. Surveyor Scope is super good, which can put 3 lands onto the battlefield, and those come in untapped, which is pretty awesome. Aerial Surveyor fetches a plains if someone controls more lands. We got Spiteful Repossession, which can generate, I'm curious to hear how much it has, but I don't think it's unreasonable to think like 10 or more treasure tokens, which is the difference in land control. Then there's Scholar of New Horizons, which can put a plains onto the battlefield. And although these aren't dependent on land count, I'm going to mention a few other synergies like Strict Proctor, which can bypass the Lotus Field sacrifice requirements or the bounce land effects if you don't pay the 2. And Scare Tiller, which can return lands from your graveyard since there's likely going to be a lot of lands in your graveyard. Once the deck has all of this mana, you've ramped a lot. It plays several strong X spells, which can do a lot of damage to creatures without flying and players. So examples include Earthquake, Subterranean Tremors, and Fault Line to deal damage to creatures and players. Magma Quake also deals damage to non-flyers and Planeswalkers instead of players. Then there's the X spell, the Roller Crusher Ride, which can double up damage while also dealing damage itself. I emailed the owner to ask a little more about the deck, and they said that Repercussion can end games instantly when you have it on the battlefield and you cast a large Earthquake spell, but you leave this situation unharmed because you're just running flyers, and these Earthquake spells only deal damage to non-flyers. I also asked, all right, then, if you're dealing all of this damage to non-flyers, how do you perform against like Dragon decks or other decks that run a lot of flyers? And they said, yeah, that does make sense, but we do have other ways to deal with those, like Calamity of Cinders, Split Up, Aloran Searing Light, Parting Gust, Sheltered by Ghosts, Transmogrifying Wand. So they run a lot of other interaction as well. So the nice thing about having Lulu as a commander is you essentially give these flyers vigilance and you make them stronger every turn. Some of my favorites, I love Battle Angels of Tyr, which has Myriad. There's Cavern Horde Dragon, which can create a ton of treasures. Glorybringer can deal 4 damage to non-dragons. Cavalier of Flame is a great dump for all of the mana that you're generating. And Aerial Extortionist is great for exiling threats and drawing cards. I really feel like there's so much that I could talk about. It does run other draw packages. It has good protection spells, some life gain tricks, and as mentioned, some of that great recursion. The owner said that this is a bracket 3 deck and has about a 35% win rate, but it also fares pretty well against higher brackets too. Overall, I think it's a super fun deck that is different than the typical Boros strategies that you don't, it's something that you don't see every day. And I actually agree. It looks like this can outramp green decks. So for anyone interested in seeing the list of all 110 decks and their primers, I shared the spreadsheet in the Patreon and in the Discord. It's such a fun read, and this gives a lot of great ideas for your own decks. So every time we do a competition, patrons will receive access to the primers and the deck lists if you want to check that out in the description. Number 2, we are now going to read about Halsin, Emerald Archdruid, and Agent of the Iron Throne, which have 58 decks total online. This deck is called One Enchanting Druid. So Halsin is a 4-mana 2/4 elf druid that has an ability that lets you pay 1 mana to turn a target token you control into a green bear creature until end of turn with base power and toughness 4/4, in addition to its other colors and types. So what did this deck owner have to say? They said, what makes my deck unique is that it uses the role tokens from Wilds of Eldraine. This is an extremely powerful, in my eyes, since this turns our command zone into the sacrifice outlet and the drain part. Let me explain. The role tokens are auras, and Halsin can turn these auras into creatures. This causes them to fall off the creature they are attached to, since a creature cannot be attached to another creature. Then the aura will go to the graveyard, since it is no longer attached to a creature. Since Agent of the Iron Throne says, when a creature or artifact goes to the graveyard, it will trigger it. My problem with aristocrat decks is you have to solve that 3-piece problem of sacrifice, tokens, and drain. And now that there are 2 of the 3 pieces in the command zone, it becomes so much more powerful. So this deck is unique from other Halsin decks because of the type of token it is trying to use. This also gives the deck an Enchantress sub-theme, taking advantage of the ETBs of the role tokens that will give, while throwing in some extra enchantments to support the theme much more. The auras need to be on creatures and cannot be on the same creature or they fall off. To help with this problem, there are many creatures in the deck so that we never run out of options. This is an Aristocrats enchantment deck. Okay, that was a mouthful, but that pretty much explained the whole plan of this deck, which I think is super fun. I've always thought that a role token deck would be really interesting because it's a very cheap way to activate Constellation. And also, a lot of the role token granters are rather unpopular because they're kind of overcosted. So I like seeing a deck take advantage of this kind of more unpopular theme and finding synergies that make this work. In particular, I think that Wicked tokens are pretty strong with this deck because it drains the table for 1 when it goes to the graveyard. So if you pair that with aristocrat effects, it can quickly add up to 2, 3, or 4 damage per token that goes to the graveyard. So for Wicked role token creators, there's Conceited Witch for 1 mana adventure. There's Twisted Sewer Witch, Ariet's Whisper, Shatter the Oath, Not Dead After All, which is a good protection spell. Lord Skitter's Blessing can be a card draw on each of your turns, and the Witch's Vanity. Then there's 7 other role token creators across monster tokens, which grant trample, royal tokens, which grant ward 1, and cursed role tokens, which makes that 14 total in this deck. So with all of those enchantment tokens entering the battlefield, there's a bunch of constellation effects to take advantage of it. There's Composer of Spring, which can put a land from your hand onto the battlefield, or a creature if you have 6 or more enchantments. Doomwake Giant makes opponents' creatures get -1/-1 whenever an enchantment enters, which is actually pretty strong, with how many you could be putting on. Eidolon of Blossoms draws a card for each enchantment entering. Nessian Wanderer can get lands into your hand from the top of your library. Citizen Champion gets stronger and draws a card. And Thoughrender Lamia makes opponents discard a card. Then for the drain effects, I think it's really interesting because aside from the background, which does care about creatures, there isn't really much creature aristocrat effects like Zulaport Cutthroat. So what this deck does run are cards like Belmerk Leech and Grim Guardian, which drain opponents by 1 when enchantments enter the battlefield. Then there's things like Wicked Visitor, which cares about when they leave the battlefield. A few other, pillars are populate effects like Hazel of the Root Bloom, which creates a copy of a target token and can generate a ton of mana by tapping said aura tokens. Selesnya Eulogist can populate. There's Springheart Nantuko, which can create copies of tokens when they come down when a land enters the battlefield. And then there's Second Harvest, which can win games just out of nowhere by doubling every token you own, and then you drain because enchantments enter. You get Constellation. There's just so much that doubling Second Harvest can do. There's a lot of great card draw effects like Ashiok's Reaper, Elvish Archivist. There's Hateful Eidolon, Death Reap Ritual, which can draw a card each turn if a creature dies. And then one other top performer that the deck did mention is Chthonian Nightmare, which can return the important creatures and role token creators again and again and again. Or there's also Animate Dead to get back your important creatures, or a bomb from an opponent's graveyard if you need that. This isn't an overwhelming deck. I think it's casual, I think it's unique, and it's really fun. I wouldn't feel bad losing to this deck because it is a cool strategy that I haven't seen before. The deck list is in the description of the video, and the 3 others as well if you want to check them out. So, if you thought that those 2 were interesting, check out this next one. I think it's hilarious, and I've never seen a strategy like it. This one is called Gale's Bathroom Break and is a Gale Waterdeep Prodigy and Noble Heritage deck, which has 33 total decks. Gale is a 3-mana 1/3 human wizard that says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand, you may cast up to 1 target card of the other type from your graveyard. If a spell cast from your graveyard this way would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. Then Noble Heritage says, commander creatures you own have, when this creature enters the battlefield and at the beginning of your upkeep, each player may put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature they control. For each opponent who does, you gain protection from that player until your next turn. So now that we've gone over the cards, here's what the owner has to say about this deck. This deck's goal is to use Noble Heritage to buff our opponents and get protection from them until our next turn, then never getting to that turn with cards like Eater of Days. There are a lot of ways we can abuse until end of turn, until your next turn. Detain and Goad, both are until your next turn. Things like Reflector Mage and Hope of Girapur can alter what our opponents can cast until our next turn. Then there's multiple blink and flicker effects, which let us trigger Noble Heritage multiple times a turn, making anyone who doesn't take the offer have some serious threats, while there are ways to still get protection from people who don't. The cheap blink spells get double synergy with Gale, letting us recast the other blink and bounce spells. They get triple synergy with the suite of artifact tutor mages we can step through for to double or triple upon their ETBs. This rounds us out with an artifact package to untap our artifacts like Unwinding Clock and play at instant speed with Wrath Capuchin on our opponent's turns to further benefit from skipping ours. So, as the name of the deck suggests, you buff up your opponent's creatures, gain protection from them, then skip your next turns pretty much indefinitely and let opponents whittle each other down. So in terms of cards that let you skip your turn, there's Chronotog, which once you gain protection from all your opponents, can let you keep skipping your turns because this can only be activated, once each turn, but it doesn't clarify that that's at instant speed. There's Eater of Days, which when it enters the battlefield, skips your next 2 turns. So if you ephemerate that, that's 4 turns, and it just gets silly from there. Meditate draws you 4 cards at instant speed and skips your next turn. Chronotog Totem needs to be a creature first, and then after that, you can skip your next turn. And Magosi the Waterveil is a land that can skip your next turn. So as mentioned a little bit in that description, if your opponents don't choose to put +1/+1 counters and give you that protection, you can make a big threat to them by bouncing your creatures multiple times or using ETB doublers like Panharmonicon or Nabandine of Iteration to get 2 triggers for each ETB and just dish out those +1 counters like candy. So if someone chooses not to, they're at risk because you just buffed up your other opponents. But as mentioned, if 2 out of 3 opponents give you protection, there are ways to gain protection from the one who didn't. Things like Perch Protection, which is kind of like a more expensive Teferi's Protection, and gives one of your opponents an extra turn to do your bidding and attacking. The Stasis Coffin can give you protection from everything. Eon Frolicker is a great way to gain protection from the opponent who chooses not to give you protection with Noble Heritage. And Chronomantic Escape prevents creatures from attacking you until your next turn. During said skipped turns, there's several cards that let you cast things during their turns, like Gandalf the White, Final Word Phantom, Wrath Capuchin, Ship's Mage, which this lets you, stay relevant. And then since you're missing some land drops, you play a lot of Artifact Ramp. So something like Unwinding Clock lets you untap those mana rocks every turn to continue playing those spells. Then there's great abilities that abuse that until your next turn phrase, like Hope of Girper to restrict someone from casting non-creature spells. Reflector Mage can keep 2 people's commanders in their hands until your turn, whenever that comes, who knows when that will be. And Living Breakthrough can shut out people from casting spells entirely. And this is the flip side of Inventive Iteration, in case anyone's curious. When it finally does become your turn, I didn't see it in the deck, but I think something like Claim Jumper could do a ton of work in ramping you back up for the turns that you skipped, or Keeper of the Accord to build up your board and lands while you're taking your bathroom break. But there are a lot of other, fun tricks. There's something like Drain Power, which can take other people's resources. And there's just a lot of good ETB effects, artifact tutors, and powerful things that can actually help you in a 1v1 scenario. Once again, I think super fun, unique idea, and there's probably a lot of people out there who have always wanted to have or find a way to include Eater of Days, and so it's just really cool to see that you actually did it. We are down to our last one, and once again, if you want to see all the other 106 decks that I didn't mention or cover in this, you can see that on the Patreon link in the description below. So the last deck is called Shameless Burakos and is Burakos Party Leader paired with Shameless Charlatan, which only has 6 decks. Burakos is a 4-mana 2/4 that says Burakos is also a cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard. Whenever Burakos attacks, defending player loses X life and you create X treasure tokens, where X is the number of creatures in your party. Shameless Charlatan is a 2-mana enchantment that says commander creatures you own have pay 2 generic and 1 blue. This creature becomes a copy of another target creature. So the deck owner had to say about this deck, this deck focuses more on the Charlatan using Burakos' treasures to shapeshift multiple times in a single turn, change into an unblockable rogue, and then after you bypass blockers, turn into a massive powerhouse for big damage and saboteur effects. Training Grounds reduces the cost of Charlatan to a single blue mana, and if Burakos is a Myriad creature, you can then change it into another creature before Myriad resolves to create multiple attacking powerhouse tokens. Becoming a consuming aberration can easily knock out a player in one hit. For context, which I thought was interesting, there are 30 backgrounds, and excluding Faceless One, Shameless Charlatan is the most unpopular background, and Burakos is one of the most unpopular combinations. So this is almost, as unloved as it gets in terms of background decks. I like it because it makes sense. You can create up to 4 treasures when you swing, so you can set up some fun copy attacks at instant speed. So breaking down the game plan, this deck first looks to play evasive creatures. These are like low to the ground, unblockable creatures like Tormented Soul, Slitherblade, Mistcloaked Herald, Escape Artist, and Changeling Outcast. Then there's other great unblockable creatures like Cephalid Facetaker, which is unblockable and can become another creature too, and Silent Hall Creeper, which can draw a card, get bigger, or copy one of your big threats. Then aside from these evasive creatures, this deck wants creatures in your party to maximize the number of treasures that you can create. There's 15 total creatures that are either a cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard, including 4 changeling creatures, which can help you get to 4 all at once. Once you have creatures in your party and can create up to 4 treasures when you attack, the goal is to have big beater creatures that you can transform into when you get past blockers. Super fun abilities here. There's Awakened Amalgam, which can attack for a lot of damage. Consuming Aberration can become 2 copies on the battlefield and mill a ton of cards to make this a 20 or a 30/30 creature. Demon of Wailing Agonies gets bigger and makes the person sacrifice a creature. Fallen Shinobi can cast some free stuff. There's Lord of the Void, which can put a creature from the opponent's library onto your battlefield. Quicksilver Gargantuan is one I haven't seen in a long time. It's pretty much a 7/7 copy of any creature on the battlefield, not just your creatures. Spawning Kraken can create multiple tokens because if you're copying it, that means that there's another on the battlefield. So there's multiple triggers. And Sphinx Ambassador is probably one of my favorite all-time combat damage triggers. Essentially, you search the person's library and pick a creature, then they guess the creature. And if they're wrong, you put it on the battlefield. So it kind of creates that minigame aspect of, ooh, should I pick their best creature? Should I pick one that they would never guess? And you're trying to figure out which card do I think that they would guess. The other creatures that can have like a good role in the deck are Auton Soldier and Broodbirth Viper, and also Dalek Squadron, which all have Myriad. I also think Blade of Selves could put in some work in the deck if you included it, or Evasive Equipment, so you don't need to pay mana for the first activation to turn Burakos into an unblockable creature. You would already have that evasion. This deck also runs 11 manlands, a bunch of reconnaissance mission type draw effects, and other good on damage effects like Grim Hireling to create more treasure tokens. I think that this strategy is more straightforward than some of the others that we've seen, but I really like the idea of focusing on Shameless Charlatan and doing 2 activations in one turn as opposed to just one. And like I said, it's a very, very unpopular deck, so it's cool to see someone find a way to make it work. I think this would be a fun one to pilot for sure. That's all that we have today. Like I said, there's a poll live for you right now to vote on your favorite deck that we covered today. The poll will be live for 5 days. Then I will ship the prize to the winner. Be on the lookout for a video in the next week or so, sharing details of the next competition, which, like I said, is going to be live soon. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you next time.